a year. But, you know, shoveling all the time, like people who live further north, that's just exhausting.
Yes, it is. I was concerned about him because of his age and shoveling so much. You know, it's not good because we have a slope also for the garage to put our car in the garage, and that slope piles up snow because since it's slope, it goes down, so the snow goes in there.
Right.
And it was a lot of work for him. So I'm glad that we left that. So we left my son with the house. He's taking care of the house now.
All right, just getting a few more things set up. Popping out to the chat. And that over there, just waiting for other people to, okay, I think that's got the technology set up. Okay, now we just sit back and wait for more people to log in. Looks like a slow night tonight. Maybe everybody's having their Hanukkah celebrations right now. That's a cute little bundle you have in your lap. Looks a little sleepy. Let me just check if some of our regulars are planning to attend or not. Oh, there's one.
Hey, Rabbi.
Hello, how you doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing great.
Hey, Rabbi, did you get that email I sent you?
Which one?
So it's about Friday's sermon when you said Judah and Tamar had twins, which was interesting because there were two dead sons. So you had one that could potentially serve as a levirate to each of the dead sons. But when I tried to look up the family history, the sons were omitted, Aaron, Onan.
Well, yes, because they, you know, they did not continue in and of themselves.
Right. But you said the father's marriage was a levirate marriage, though, right? Judah's marriage to Tamar?
Ish. Right. So that's the slippery part of trying to handle this in advance of the actual giving of the Torah a few generations later. All right. Well, I found out that there's a federation meeting going on, so some people are busy with the needs of the community in that way. And it looks like we have some more of our regulars logging in now. So I think we can go ahead and begin. Again, Hanukkah Sameach to everyone. We are going to finish Sotah tonight. I am reasonably confident. We will seem to be taking a left turn as we continue our discussion of the broken neck heifer, the one that was killed when there was an anonymous murder done in the middle of nowhere. But as you're going to see, this will really be trying to bring the whole theme of Sotah to a conclusion. There is a lot to say about these final few Mishnayot. And for those of you that have stuck with a topic which has not always seemed precisely relevant to modern day, since we can't perform these rituals, I hope that you'll feel rewarded for your determination.
Hopefully the connection is not between breaking the neck of the cow and the Sotah. Yes.
Well, there's a connection, but not about breaking necks.
Okay.
All right, so let's go ahead and pick up where we left off, which is chapter 9 of Mishnah Sotah, and with Mishnah number 9. When murderers, I speak English, I swear, when murderers multiplied, the ceremony of breaking a heifer's neck ceased. So just make sure you understand what they said is when there became more and more murders in the land, when murder became commonplace, they stopped performing the ritual that we had been describing over the last few Mishnayot. The measuring to the towns, the bringing out, the breaking, the washing, the declaration. They said, you know what? We're done. Now, why? Well, there's a hint in the next line that at least some of the commentators point to. That was from the time of Elazar ben Dinai, and he was also called Tehina ben Perisha, and he was afterwards renamed son of a murderer. So apparently Eliezer ben Dinai is a famous murderer, serial killer.
From the Galil, correct?
Well, that's the idea, yes. That the rest of the teachings and later writings describe him as being basically a mass murderer. And this became symptomatic that people like him would go around and would murder wantonly. And therefore, even though we would find a body, it wasn't like we didn't know who was doing it. It may have been this guy, it may have been one of the other murderers, but it wasn't just a random one-off occurrence. This was part of a collection of violence, and therefore it was not considered to be as unknowable. There wasn't as much doubt as there was in the earlier cases. And you may remember one of the running themes that we've had since the very beginning of Sotah is that this type of ritual, which is there to alleviate and answer the call of doubt, to deal with places where we don't have enough information, these rituals are derailed. We leave them whenever even a shred of information comes out that can give us just enough certainty or at least suspicion that we don't continue with 100% doubt. So that seems to be the idea here, is that there was no longer enough doubt to continue the ceremony of the broken neck heifer. Aaron.
Yes. Previously, didn't we learn how much evidence they needed to not break the neck? And now it seems like they're implementing a different rule saying, based on the circumstantial evidence or prior acts, we can assume that the current act based on the prior acts?
Right. So in the previous Mishnayot, we saw that case by case, they would have different evidentiary levels of how many people would say they did see, didn't see, and witnesses and such. But this is saying that, yes, in certain circumstances where the rules of the game have changed, meaning murder has become so commonplace as to just be expected rather than a surprise, that we really are operating under a different set of rules. So does that count as change? That is the $1 million question. Right? Does this count as uprooting something from the Torah under the circumstances? Now, obviously, the rabbis would answer no. They were not uprooting the Torah. They were instead implementing the Torah under very unusual circumstances. And that is going to be a much more long-term debate. It's one that people continue to ask now, not necessarily about breaking the necks of cows, which is sort of not going to happen in the near future, but instead about other changes that may be necessary or suggested by changes in times and circumstances and cultures. We're going to see, let me just see the next one on the table as well, because it's of similar type.
It's about propensity evidence though, right? Because this is so...
Well, let me get the next one on the table and then we can summarize both of them at maybe in the same time. When adulterers multiplied, the ceremony of bitter waters, the Sotah ceased, and it was Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai who discontinued it. As he said, I will not punish their daughters for fornicating, nor their daughters-in-law for committing adultery, for they themselves turn aside with whores and sacrifice with prostitutes, taken from Hosea 4. So here we see an even stronger statement that the issue is not just of evidence, although that is definitely one way to interpret it, but instead with, well, the term I think you used was propensity, right, of how commonplace has this become. And we saw earlier in the issues with Sotah that one of the things that could derail the Sotah ritual was if the husband, the so-called aggrieved party, who believed that he had been cheated on, if he has behaved inappropriately, then the ritual will have no effect on his wife, whom he suspects. And what Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is saying here is that adultery is so commonplace, and it takes two to commit adultery, that there is no reliable way to believe that the average husband coming has not himself been guilty of this crime, which would therefore make the ritual not effective against his wife, which would therefore make someone who would know she had committed adultery in some cases seem like she had gotten away with it and that God was powerless to affect her. So it was better for the dignity of Torah, for the honor of God, to simply dispense with the ritual. And I think we could even argue backwards with regards to the broken-necked cow, that likewise, it doesn't really seem like you're getting rid of the guilt in the land if you're breaking cows' necks every other day because of all the bodies you're finding. This doesn't seem like it's working, if you will. Again, not that it was meant to work, as we talked about last week, but certainly in the eyes of the common people, there would seem to be a shortcoming in divinity if these things were continuing despite the immorality that was around them. Now, continue your comment, and then Natan, you can after him.
Yes. Can we see this as an hidden critique to the Roman culture? Because all coincidence, they stop all this, the destruction of the values and moral of society is all by coincidence after the Bar Kokhba rebellion, when the Romans were completely under control. Can we see this as a hidden critique?
This is before Bar Kokhba. This is
before. Yes, you're right.
This is during the end of the Second Temple period.
But still, the Romans were there, and they have all the influence of the culture.
Okay, so we get to talk about chicken and egg, which is also a perfect topic for Hanukkah as well. Was it the corrupt, immoral Romans that adulterated, pardon the pun, our culture and turned the people into these rascals? Or was it our immorality that invited the Romans in? As much as I just finished honoring the Maccabees and what they did, their descendants, as we've mentioned multiple times and discussed, were not great people. They were corrupt, they were immoral, and when your king is like that, and really the whole king's family, that has a huge influence on the nation. So it seems that from the corruption from the top and from the multiplication of different factions that were at war with each other, that the Romans stepped into a culture that was already going down the tubes. And I don't think they were the ones who made us the way we are. Did it speed things up? Did it exacerbate? Did it add fuel to the fire? Of course. I'm not going to say the Romans are innocent, far from it. But I don't think we can blame the Romans for being the cause. The same way that we don't blame the Babylonians for being the cause or the Assyrians for being the cause of the problems in the south and the north back during the First Temple times. It was the corruption within the nation itself that opened the door for those invasions.
Yeah, but there's a difference between the Babylonians and the Romans. The Babylonians, they conquer us with the weapons, but not culturally. The Romans, they conquer us culturally. They create the stadiums, the gymnasiums, and all the culture of the body. And when you have a culture of the body, of the holiness of the body, that's affect their whole society, because you are educated since school about all about the bodies, and so all the limits about relationship between husband and wife and everything is also affected.
True, but I think you are underestimating the Babylonians in the first hand. They had a huge influence on Jewish culture, not to the same degrees in morality, but the very fact that as we celebrate Rosh Chodesh Kislev, these are the months that we now use. The names of our months are Babylonian names. Those are not original names that are found within the Torah. They are not biblical names. They are Babylonian. And likewise, the overwhelming evidence seems to suggest that some of the other activities that our people brought back were of Babylonian influence. So I don't think you can say the Babylonians did not influence us. But more to the point, we were already following the Hellenistic ideas of worshiping the body and indulging in all the sensual pleasures regardless of the consequences. During the days of the Hashmonean dynasty. They had already embraced that Hellenistic ideal before the Romans set their armies on our shore. So did they speed it up? Did they build more theaters? Did they build more places for prostitution? Yes, of course. But we were already receptive to that. And that is to our shame as much as to their blame.
Which other games or activity we bring from Babylonia?
Well, it depends on exactly how far down you want to go that rabbit hole. One of the most famous aspects is that it seems that a lot of the angelology, the different focusing on angels, seems to have been heavily influenced by Babylonian cosmology. That does not seem to have been something that was found within the early writings of the Torah. When you get actual names to angels and they have special jobs and things like that, that does seem to be fairly Babylonian.
I think it was more Persia, with Sophilic, the empire after the Persians. Also, they were very strong with the angels, no?
Absolutely, and the whole idea of astrology and such. So those things do seem to have been at least accentuated and perhaps named.
So in addition to the angels, what else?
So I'll send you a list of some of the things later on.
Okay.
I want to make sure we can finish Sotah tonight.
Okay.
Hey, Rabbi, briefly, just out of curiosity, how fair is it to blame the leaders, like the Hasmoneans, where during the time of Herod, didn't it seem like the majority of the population rejected, and I'll use the word immoral, but not really, the ways of King Herod for that of the rabbis?
Yes and no. So you're always right to blame the leaders for the corruption of the population when the leaders are corrupt. It starts at the top and it trickles down. But were the people completely influenced? Were they completely given over? No. But were they degraded? Yes. And even among the people, we find that the rank and file may have been leaning towards the rabbis, at least in the rabbinic telling, but they were not wholehearted. The whole idea of the Am Haaretz, the ignorant person, as being almost the standard, is indicative that a large percentage, perhaps even a majority, did not fully embrace Rabbinic Judaism, even if they lived by many of the traditions that Rabbinic Judaism was supporting. There was overlap, but that doesn't mean identity. And it certainly doesn't mean morality. All right, and now we're going to begin a whole section on this idea of corruption. When Yosef ben Yozer of Zereda and Yosef ben Yochanan of Jerusalem died, the grape clusters ceased. As it is said, there is not a cluster, meaning of grapes, to eat, nor a ripe fig I could desire. The pious are vanished from the land, none upright are left among men. So this is beginning a series of almost eulogies that we're going to hit over the course of the last few Mishnayot, of trying to say that there are certain people that were of outstanding caliber and character, and when they die, we lost something. In this particular case, the phrase of being grape clusters were considered to be people who were rich and full of different teachings and wisdom, like a cluster of grapes that you can always find a new thing from. But when they went, we no longer had people of that style. To continue the previous part of our Mishnah, the Reisha, in the next Mishnah, we're going to talk again about things that changed at different times. Yochanan the high priest brought an end to the confession made at the presentation of the tithe. He also discontinued the wakers and knockers up to his days, his wakers and the knockers up to his days, the knockers up, period. To his days, the hammer used to strike in Jerusalem, and in his days, there was no need to inquire about doubtfully tithed produce. Sorry, just trying to get all the words out. All right, so a number of things that are happening here. One of them is the end of the confession made at the presentation of the tithe, that there was a particular way of doing this, which he no longer implemented it because he felt it no longer applied. Likewise, the wakers were considered to be the Levi'im, who had a special job of reciting a certain psalm, which he also discontinued, and the knockers likewise had a particular role which was no longer seen as being appropriate. The ideas of the day of the hammer striking in Jerusalem is talking about during the time, or during his time, there was an argument in general about whether or not a person can do work on Chol HaMoed, on the intermediate days of a holiday, like the middle days of Sukkot or the middle days of Pesach. Generally speaking, people believe that if the work is absolutely necessary and you would be in great difficulty if you didn't perform it, that yes, it is permitted to go ahead and do that work. However, during his day, it was perfectly allowed for people to go ahead and strike the hammer, meaning do that type of work during that time. That was allowed. And then the last one is the one that is perhaps more back to the question that Aaron had about how loyal were the people, right? During his days, you didn't have to ask about the demai. The demai was the doubtful produce, which was produce that had been taken and maybe tithed by somebody who was not one of the rabbinic Jewish group, somebody who did not keep according to the laws of tithing as carefully as the rabbis had instituted. But during his days, people were careful enough, and therefore you didn't need to make those inquiries. So it's setting off during his day that things were better, and now not so much. Now we do have to ask for those things.
Rabbi.
Yes.
Is that Yohanan? Is that the Maccabees' father?
No.
Oh.
The Maccabees' father was Matityahu.
Not Matthew.
But there was one of the descendants, one of the sons was named Yochanan.
That's the Yohanan from the Maccabees, or no?
No. This is considered to be the one that came after Shimon HaTzadik during the Second Temple days. later than the Maccabees, like, 60, 70 years later.
So Yohanan Cohen Gadol
Yes.
wasn't positive.
He was what?
He wasn't positive. Like
No, he was positive. Making changes doesn't mean things are bad.
yeah, but I think today we work in Kol HaMoed.
We do now, yes. But that has become sort of the common practice. But in some communities, they still do try to not work on Chol HaMoed. But unfortunately,
And it says here that in his days no man can to inquire regarding the mind, meaning everyone knew how to do it correctly, or is that no one cared?
No. Everyone knew how to, and so there wasn't as much doubt about whether someone else had.
Okay, that's why I wasn't clear if it was a positive or negative. Because
Right.
you can read it either way.
Well, but I mean, the idea of the wakers and the knockers gives us more of an idea that this was a positive time, right? Because the wakers, in addition to having this idea of the psalm that they would recite, the issue that he had, at least according to rabbinic reading, was that it made it sound like the Levites were calling for God to wake up. And so he felt that sounded too much like idolatry. Like, what, is God fall asleep? And on the same idea, the Nokfim, the idea, according to the rabbis, is that when they would bring in a cow to slaughter it, they would knock it in the head so that it would be dazed and there would be blood in its eyes so that it wouldn't make as much trouble before it became slaughtered. And he considered that to be a problem. He said, no. First of all, it looks like a blemish. And second of all, you may be tearing the membrane around the brain inside. You may be making it trafe when you do that. And so instead, they set up a special like a special stock for the animal to be moved into, so it wouldn't freak out before the slaughter.
So I thought that the awakeners was for the people that went to the temple, that everyone fell asleep. That was so low. The people that they went there, that everyone fell asleep and no one paid attention. That's why I was so confused how to take it.
That was not the commentary that I studied.
Okay.
That's the problem when people use jargon in the Mishnah. Unless you have an additional explanation, sometimes it's like, I don't know what that was. So in this case, there's other rabbinic teachings that talk about this group or this job. And it was more about a certain recitation and praise. But he felt that it was too close to sounding almost idolatrous. Mishnah 11. When the Sanhedrin ceased to function, song ceased from the places of feasting. As it is said, they drink their wine without song. So here the idea is that when the Sanhedrin was finally canceled, and there are different times that this can be attributed to. We can either talk about when the Sanhedrin was not felt to be legitimate in the eyes of the rabbis, which happened at certain points during the Second Temple days, or during the times when the Sanhedrin was being outlawed by the Romans at other times. There are multiple windows of opportunity for when this might have been taught before the Mishnah was compiled. But the point is that when the Sanhedrin went down, we no longer had a place to resolve those disputes and no longer had that symbol of our autonomy. And that meant that we couldn't be fully joyful. And the songs, therefore, were ceased from places of feasting. Now, there are many who push back and say, but only for frivolous feasting. If it's a mitzvah, then of course people would continue to sing because that's in celebration of God. Mishnah 12. When the former prophets died, those are the early prophets, the Urim and Tumim ceased. when the former prophets, I should point out, those are the ones who were the prophets prior to the destruction of the first temple. When the temple was destroyed, the Shamir and the Nofet Tzufim ceased, and the people of faith ceased, as it says, "Help, O Lord, for the faithful are no more." So the Shamir is a very interesting character in rabbinic thinking. The Shamir was believed to be a creature that was able to eat through, carve through rock. It was like a worm that you would use to divide stones. And it was believed to have been used in order to cut the stones of the temple so that no iron had to be used against them. Are people familiar with that concept? Maybe? Okay. And then the Nofet Tzufim was considered to be a special type of honey that was supposed to be the best honey ever. And that's going to come back on the next level in just a second. So, and then the idea of the faith the faith that is done, right? The Anshe Amanah, right? The people who have deep belief and trust in God, that is being tied into Psalms with the idea that the faithful are no more, that the Hasid is no longer there. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, in the name of Rabbi Joshua, from the day the temple was destroyed, there was no day without a curse. The dew has not descended for a blessing, and the flavor has departed from produce. Rabbi Yossi says the fatness was also removed from produce. So every day is worse than the day before, is what he is saying. And the food doesn't taste as good as it used to. If you're old enough, you'll probably already feel this way. When I was a kid, I tell you the fruit tasted so much better than the fruit does today. Now, in my case, that's absolutely objectively true. I think, we can point to changes in how we grow fruit and why that's happened, especially bananas, by the way. If you're old enough to remember the bananas that existed before the plague wiped out all the bananas and we had to get new bananas, that, would absolutely be true. And what Rabbi Yossi is adding here at the end is that the fat of the produce is considered by at least the other commentaries to be the nutritional value of the food. That not only does the food not taste as good as it used to, but the food doesn't even feed us the way it used to. So we're seeing a progression of the descents of these generations. Things are getting worse and worse and worse. Questions or comments on Mishnah 12? Do people have days like this where they think that everything is just getting worse and worse and, it's not as good as it was when I was a kid and my grandfather told me things used to be better?
Yes.
By the way, Urim and Tumim, I forgot, I didn't point out what those were. Those were the stones that were kept in the ephod, in the Hoshen Mishpat, the special breast piece that was worn by the Kohen Gadol. They were two special rocks that were used as a way of trying to understand what God wanted, almost like, it sounds trite, but fortune telling, but a very special way of trying to gain more insight on God's wishes. But those are long gone. Okay, Mishnah 13. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says, the cessation of the observation of purity laws has removed taste and fragrance. The cessation of the observation of tithes has removed the fatness of grain. But the sages say licentiousness and sorcery destroyed everything. So he is arguing that when people failed to keep the laws of purity, when they failed to keep the laws of washing their hands, of using the mikveh, and all the other ways that we try to keep pure according to Jewish law, that food doesn't taste or smell as sweet anymore. And similarly, when people stopped keeping the tithes, again, the fatness of the grain, the nutrition of the grain no longer is there anymore. And this is very fitting, right? That the bonus and beauty to the world that comes by actually being careful of making sure things are pure is absolutely what we would expect to go along with its adornment. And likewise, our keeping of the tithes and the sharing of the food that we grow, that is something that should be making sure we distribute the benefit of the land. But if we don't do that, then the land is not going to benefit us either. And then finally, the sages give their own flip to all of this. They don't disagree that things are worse, but they have a different target for their blame. And they blame licentiousness, adultery, and other forms of fooling around with people, and sorcery, the use of this, magic and other types of things, that is what's caused all of the problems.
Those last Mishnayot are very depressed. Oh my God. I think they need a drink of Arak. Yeah.
So we are moving down. I promise if you stick with it, we are going to come up at the end.
It will not be so difficult because it's so down.
There's nowhere to go but up.
No.
Okay, so what's going on here, right? Before we get into the last couple Mishnayot, let's give a little more context to all of this. So what are the rabbis lamenting? Well, remember, we've had this entire Masechet, this entire section on Sotah that is dealing with one of the most painful problems that can happen to a family, this issue of adultery or suspected adultery. Either she is guilty, in which case it is heartbreaking, or she's innocent and her husband's jealousy is wrong, in which case it is heartbreaking. And a person either commits adultery or becomes jealous, as the Mishnah has said earlier, out of this stupidity. And the rabbis are seeing this as being multiplying over and over and over again. And they're seeing that they are losing the ability to convince the people to try and live a better life, to live in a proper way. The rabbis were really very concerned in their day with many of the same things we're concerned with in our day. Right? We look out into our world, those of us who are studying Mishnah, who are trying to keep Torah, and we see Jews of all kinds ignoring the traditions, ignoring the wisdom, not keeping the commandments, falling away into assimilation and forgetting their Judaism completely. We see the world as a whole full of people being corrupt and vain and petty and violent. It makes you think that there's no future. And that was the feeling that the rabbis had as well. Right? They had lived through their own destruction. They had lived through their own Shoah, if you will, really a couple of them, from the destruction of the temple and then the Bar Kokhba revolt. And they are also thinking, what's the point? There is no joy in the world. The food is dead. Everything is wrong. And it's wrong because we've just been so bad. We're going to come up from that. But this is all contextualized within that feeling that it's not surprising about Sotah, that it's not surprising that it comes at the end of this Masechet. All right, so let's get through 14. During the war with Vespasian. So first of all, I just want to point out, because it's the seventh night of Hanukkah, and we were talking about Hellenism before, the word that's used for war here. Any of our Hebrew readers able to tell what that first word is? Pulmos. Now my guess is that that's not a normal word to use for war in modern Hebrew. Right? Milchama is the modern word for war. What is pulmos? Pulmos is a Greek word for war. In fact, it's a Greek word for war that's based off one of their semi-gods. That is the god of war and strife. Hold that in mind for a second. During the war with Vespasian, they, the rabbis, decreed against the use of crowns worn by bridegrooms and against the use of the bell. So they used to have special ceremonies for welcoming the bride and the groom and bringing him in. They would wear special crowns. And during the war, well, things got depressing and they stopped using them. During the war with Quietus, they decreed against the use of crowns worn by brides and that nobody should teach their child Greek. So they even went further and got rid of the crowns that were worn by the brides, and you can no longer teach your child Greek. Why is that ironic here? Because the first word of this Mishnah is a Greek word. So somebody's learning Greek, or else we wouldn't have the word pulmos as the word for war in this Mishnah. So how do we explain that? Well, most of the commentators say it's not a question of whether you can learn to speak Greek or not as a language. Indeed, the Jews who lived in Alexandria and the Jews who lived in all of the other Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey and the Syrian coast communities, of course they spoke Greek. That was the language of those countries. So what the issue here was not about the language itself being forbidden. It was about the Greek way of thinking and looking at the world. Natan, you mentioned this earlier about the idea of the pursuit of vanities and the pursuit of the body, and this idea of being clever only as a means of defeating opponents, but not of seeking truth. That was what the rabbis were talking about when they say don't study Greek. If you want to study Greek as a language, by all means. And if you want to study something worthwhile in Greek, by all means. Of course, little known fact, the only other language that is Sefer Torah, an actual book of Torah can be written in and read from the Bima with the brachot, is a Greek Torah because of the Septuagint, the special version of the Torah that was written when asked for by the Ptolemies. So Greek itself is not a problem. It's the content and the Greek way of looking at the world. That was the issue that they're talking about here. During the final war, they decreed that a bride should not go out in a palanquin or marched in under a chuppah, depending upon how you read this. But our rabbis decreed that a bride may go out in a palanquin inside the city. Right? This was a step too far. The rabbis said, no, we're too miserable. It's too sad. It's too horrible. We're taking away this celebration as well. But the people basically said, no. Right? No, we're going to do this. And the rabbis went along with it and said, yes, we will permit that celebration form because it's your wedding and you have to have that.
I read in some place that all these changes of customs and traditions were because the rabbis saw that the Romans began to rape the future wives.
The bride, yes.
The brides. So they tried to prevent it. So that's why in this way the Romans cannot know who will be married, who not.
So in general, there are lots of traditions and different issues that deal with that issue of the Romans trying to rape the bride. But in context, this section is dealing with the decreasing of our joy, of trying to recognize the world as broken and bad, and we just can't celebrate like we used to because I'm too depressed. I'm just not going to throw a party like I would have, when there wasn't the war. So I would argue that in this context, they are really talking more about not being able to summon the joy, the cheer, to be able to engage in these activities and considering these activities just inappropriate for a world that is suffering like it is. Aaron?
Rabbi, was this not teaching them Greek and stuff? Was that similar to what the ultra-Orthodox were doing in the 1800s to try to prohibit any outside influence on them?
Okay. So then that becomes a very interesting question. When the rabbis prohibited the learning of Greek, meaning Greek ideas, how far does that extend? Does that mean that we're not allowed to learn anything from another culture that is potentially dangerous? The issue being, of course, how do you know it's potentially dangerous until you've learned it? So indeed, some in the 1800s and then onwards into the modern era have tried to avoid learning anything that could be considered outside of Judaism itself. When there was a big argument with the putting in the curriculum for the standard curriculum in Israel, must have been 10 years ago or so, the ultra-Orthodox in some places ran newspaper ads pointing out that the government of Israel wanted their students to learn Euclid, and that's Greek and therefore prohibited. They were talking about geometry, of course, but because it sounded foreign, they were saying they didn't want to have to teach it to their kids. So there are some who carte blanche say, no, nothing. If it's not already in part of our tradition, we're not going to even learn it to see whether it could be useful to us. And there are others who take a moderate position, who say, no, if we know that it's bad, we're not going to study it. If we don't know, we will investigate. And when we investigate, we'll find out whether it is something that is healthy or unhealthy.
How can you reject all that Greek stuff, though, when Rambam cited Aristotle so much?
Because some people consider Rambam to be a heretic.
Really?
Oh, yeah. His books, some of his books were burned in Europe.
Right, but not in the 17 or 1800s. I thought he was pretty much universally accepted by then.
He was universally accepted as being an amazing teacher of halakha, and his philosophy was considered to be too dangerous for most people to read.
In the 1700s, 1800s?
Yes, it was not something that they would just give a sermon about, from the pulpit. They weren't going to have a class on the Moreh Nevuchim, the Guide for the Perplexed, with anybody who wanted. It was a book that they might study and share with only those who they were absolutely sure would not make a mistake in understanding the text. So it was, you might say it was under lock and key at that time. Now Rambam has had a very interesting history as part of the Masorah, as part of the chain of tradition among our people. All right, so we've all worked for it. And now we get to our final Mishnah. It's a long one, and it's a sad one, but it ends optimistically. I just have to keep reminding you that. When Rabbi Meir died, the composers of fables ceased. When Ben Azai died, the diligent students of Torah ceased. When Ben Zoma died, the expounders ceased. When Rabbi Joshua died, goodness ceased from the world. When Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel died, locusts come and troubles multiply. When Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah died, the sages ceased to be wealthy. When Rabbi Akiva died, the glory of Torah ceased. When Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa died, men of wondrous deeds ceased. When I scrolled and I lost my place. Men of wondrous, there we go. When Rabbi Yossi Katnuta died, the pious men ceased. And why is his name called Katnuta? Because he was the youngest of the pious men, or smallest of the pious men, depending upon your commentary. When Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai died, the splendor of wisdom ceased. When Rabban Gamliel the elder died, the glory of Torah ceased, and purity and separateness perished. When Rabbi Ishmael ben Fadi died, the splendor of the priesthood ceased. When Rabbi, that's Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, died, humility and fear of sin ceased. Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair says, when the temple was destroyed, scholars and freemen were ashamed and covered their head. Men of wondrous deeds were disregarded, and violent men and big talkers grew powerful. Right? So I'm just going to pause right there. I'll read the last line. And nobody expounds, nobody seeks, and nobody asks. We'll pause there before we turn it around. Yes.
But Rabbi, the order is not an historical order of the rabbis. There are some rabbis come before, come after, and
Yes.
they put it in different order. They didn't name the rabbis by chronological order. Why?
Because they're not linear. This is not Herodotus. This isn't a Greek story that goes in order. They were listing different traits that different rabbis were the avatar, the paragon of, and it was simply a matter of how the tradition was received. The order was passed down. They were not trying to give a strict chronology of the different things. Moreover, what is very interesting, in my humble opinion, is if you read in the Bavli, when you read the end of Masechet Sotah, the rabbis that are from later generations argue with all of these and point out that there are still people that represent each of these different values. So even while this Mishnah is finishing with this list of dead, 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 no more, no more, no more, no more, the Gemara, the Talmud, comes along and says, well, but there's this guy, and there's this guy, and there's this guy. And we even get one of my favorite places ever when it talked about Rabbi having died, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, that humility ceased. The very last part of the Masechet tells us that a Rabbah stands up and says, no, that's not true. There's me, right? Humility can't be gone because I'm here. Now, in America, that sounds like you're bragging. And I mean, I have to agree, and it always brings a smile to my face when I read that section. But what he's actually saying is that humility is not about saying everything's terrible. Humility is about saying what is true about yourself. And sometimes you have strengths and sometimes you have weaknesses. And a humble person can see what both of those are. And that, I think, is a great antidote to this idea that it's all dead, it's all gone, it's all dead, it's all gone. It's like, well, yeah, but I'm still here, right? So as much as you may want to make it sound like everything died in the days of in the last days of the first or second temple and in the Bar Kokhba revolt and during the days of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, that everything is dead and gone. You know what? A few hundred years later, in the times of the Talmud, the academies were flourishing, people were studying, Judaism was alive and well. Yes, life was still hard and being in exile was not easy, but we were still studying this hundreds of years after everyone in these generations thought that they were going to be the last Jews. And likewise, we are still studying, we are still learning, and I firmly believe there will be generations that come after us. As much as I can point out the problems in our current generation and work to try and solve them, even as bad as they look, I know that there will be a future for the Jewish people. So it's a very interesting look from the Talmud, but the Mishnah doesn't have the Talmud yet. The Mishnah has to find its own silver lining.
Now, it's possible, Rabbi, that the Talmud answered that way because Babylonia tried to demonstrate that they are the future, that Jerusalem is passé, and they took the torch. And it's a way to justify why they are over the academians and the yeshivot from Jerusalem, from Tiberia at that time.
Yeah, I was going to say, the Jerusalem Talmud was never written in Jerusalem because the Romans wouldn't let us. But so yes, there is definitely an element of rivalry that's happening there. But I think it was also just an element of honesty, that as terrible as everything looked during these years when we were under that Roman oppression, and as much as it looked like the great sages were being murdered or dying without people to replace them, we found a way. We found a way to keep going, and we found a way to raise up other great people and to raise up great communities. So, yeah, you know, it's bad and it's sad, but it's not the end. Which, as I say, the Mishnah didn't have that perspective because the Mishnah was just watching everything decline, even if there was a bit of an uneven decline. You know, it wasn't all down. Sometimes they were up, but the overall line was down in the land of Israel because of the Romans. They had to find their own way of keeping hope, right? So upon whom shall we depend, right? So this is the idea here. This whole list that we just said of all these great people who are now dead and no one can replace them in the eyes of the Mishnah. So who do we look to, right? Who do we depend on? Upon our Father who is in heaven, right? God. Rabbi Eliezer the Great says, from the days the temple was destroyed, the sages began to be like scribes, scribes like synagogue attendants like common people, and the common people became more and more debased. And nobody seeks. Upon whom shall we depend? Upon our Father who is in heaven, right? So it looks, you know, the people who were in the prayer generation, they were all like one rank higher than us in their greatness. And so the people who were sages, they became like scribes, a level down. The people who had been scribes, they became like the sort of regular synagogue people who showed up and actually did the work, and so on, so that everyone just got worse. So who do we depend on? We don't even have the greatness anymore. We depend on God. And in the footsteps of the Messiah, meaning in the time before the Messiah arrives. That's the term footsteps of the Messiah in Jewish literature means in the days before. Insolence, chutzpah, will increase and the cost of living will go up greatly. The vine will yield its fruit, but wine will be expensive. The government will turn to heresy and there will be no one to rebuke. The meeting place, meaning of scholars, the Beit HaMidrash, will be used for licentiousness, meaning it will be empty and taken over by those who use it for other purposes. The Galil will be destroyed, the Gablan will be desolated, many people equate that to the Golan, and the dwellers on the frontier will go about begging from place to place without anyone to take pity on them. The wisdom of the learned will rot, fearers of sin will be despised, and the truth will be lacking. Youths will put old men to shame, the old will stand up in the presence of young, in the reverse. For sons spurn father, daughters rise up against mother, daughters-in-law against mother-in-law, a man's own household are his enemies, taken from Micah. So the face of the generation will be like the face of a dog. A son will not feel ashamed before his father. Upon whom shall we depend? Upon our Father who is in heaven. So here we see a little taste of the messianism that people felt during the Mishnah time of thinking things have gotten so worse, they can only get better, right? The only possible explanation for the suffering we have is that this must be the doorstep of the Messiah. It turns out they're wrong because Messiah is still not here, but that was what they were looking at, their situation. It was so bad they felt it could be the beginning of the Messianic age, because how much worse could it possibly get? Turns out it could get a lot worse and it could get a lot better, even without the Messiah showing up just yet. All right, so we're going
That's interesting. I come in an association of ideas from there that maybe that's what people, especially Rav Kook, the son, so that now we are in the process of becoming the Messiah, because we have, after the Holocaust, that is the worst of the worst, much worse than what they described. Suddenly, the state of Israel was founded. People are going to study Judaism and never again. The Hebrew is strong. The Jewish people is strong, going back to the land of Israel. So that's why from there that the son of Rabbi Kook thought that we are almost at the edge of the Messiah time.
Right, and that's why we have, Reshit Nichat Ulatenu, the idea of the first budding blossom of redemption is built around that idea of whether or not we can look at the current situation of Jews in Israel and really finding liberation in most of the countries in the world where there's a significant Jewish population. Is that not some indication that we are in a special phase of history? Ultimately, we don't know, which is why we say Reshit Michat Ulatenu, that it is the first opening blossom, we hope. And indeed, as we've talked about before, Natan, from the Siddur that we have, Lev Shalem, there is in parentheses the idea of it will be the beginning of that, because there are some people who are still uncomfortable making the declaration that it is. Personal note, I personally feel that it is ripe. It is the potential to be. Is it inevitable at this point? No. We can still mess it up, right? That we absolutely can fail to take advantage of this opportunity to bring redemption about. I think we have it in us to mess this up, but we also have it in us to make it work. And if we make it work, then yes, you could draw a line back to the times of the Holocaust and 48, the establishment of Israel, as being that beginning of that blossom.
So, Rabbi.
Yes.
Is messing it up, is that like the equivalent of spending another 40 years in the desert?
If we're lucky, it'll only be a 40-year delay. I mean, messing it up like the way the Hashmoneans messed it up. Right? They had their independence. They fought off the Seleucids. They eventually were able to establish their kingdom, and they failed. Right? They failed to make Judaism work for the people. They failed to make Judaism inspire the people. They failed to keep Judaism themselves as a legitimate form of worship and guidance for their life and their morality. And it's no surprise that the Romans were able to take us over. We had already rotted ourselves out from the inside. Would it be possible for Israel or for American Jewry or for Jews anywhere in the world to also fail to take advantage of the unique freedoms and bounty that we have right now? Absolutely. And could we use it not to improve our own condition, our own spirit, and our own world? Absolutely. It's easy to mess it up. And how long will that put us back into waiting for another opportunity? That I don't know, because we don't calculate the end.
2,000 years.
God forbid. God forbid.
Rabbi, one final question. Just not to beat a dead horse, but does it seem weird that Judaism puts so much emphasis on community, yet has almost zero works out there on Jewish sociology?
What do you mean in terms of Jewish sociology? There's lots of works on Jewish sociology, if you mean in the academic world.
Is there? I keep looking for it. I can't find hardly anything.
And I haven't looked recently, but I've read numerous books about, the American Jewish experience and the demographics of the American community. And there's been many publications about Judaism in Israel and different subsegments of Judaism in Israel. So yeah, sociology there's a lot of research on Jews sociologically and historically in many different ways.
Does that relate to the Jewish faith at all, or is it just the migration of Jewish people and stuff?
Yes.
Oh.
So there are some researchers who focus more on a strictly secular historical analysis of person went from here, they kept this custom, they dropped that custom. And there are other people who try to research it with academic rigor, but tracing specifically the religious thoughts of different groups, of why this group ended up here and what impact it had on the observance of other people there. Those are also found in lots of sociological works.
Oh, no, I meant the other way around. Not what impact did this have on this observant, but what impact this observance had on the people.
You mean, yes, in terms of, well, I'll give you one very quick example, and then we have to wrap it up. There's been a lot of research done on day schools and also on summer camps, for that matter, on trying to see what the connection is. And there's been a lot of interesting impact study that, and it's hard to know exactly the causation so far, but day school educations and summer camp attendance for Jewish groups has shown a high correlation for long-term commitment to a Jewish identity. So that is a practice that has had Jewish sociological outcomes. Now, exactly why, whether or not the people who had that outcome would have had that anyway, and that's why they chose to be in day schools or chose to go to summer camps, that has not been untangled yet. But there definitely does seem to be some strong correlation between certain acts and certain outcomes.
All right. Thanks.
All right, so ready for our final uplifting note. Remember, this is the Mishnah's uplift because it doesn't have 2,000 years of history to look at. Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair says, heedfulness leads to cleanliness. Cleanliness leads to purity. Purity leads to separation. Separation leads to holiness. Holiness leads to modesty. Modesty leads to fear of sin. Fear of sin leads to piety. Piety leads to the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit leads to the resurrection of the dead. And the resurrection of the dead comes from Elijah. Blessed be his memory. Amen. And of course, this is meant with Elijah as the coming of the Messiah. So if you want to know what to do to fix all of this, what does Rabbi Pinchas say? Be
Step by step. Go
What's that?
step by step, and you can fix everything.
Exactly right. And starting off, it's just about your attitude, right? To have the eagerness. Heedfulness is not a great word. It's what's a good English word? It's the zeal in a positive sense, the enthusiasm to engage.
Attitude.
What?
The correct attitude.
the correct attitude, but it's an eagerness to do something, not not being depressed and sad and tired and okay, I'll do it.
Courage also.
Well, exactly, but it starts off with jumping to it with some level of eagerness, and that bit by bit by bit, before you know it, Elijah's here. Right? That is how he wants to finish off this Messiah. Not with everything is terrible, gee, I hope the Messiah comes. But everything is terrible, but if you just start with a little, we'll get there, right? We will get there. And all these things you think are lost, all of them can be reclaimed, right? All of them can be recreated.
And what is a
Right?
what I think is more
Holiness,
positive
honesty,
for,
all of that comes back. Sorry, go ahead.
what I think is more positive from Rabbi Pinchas Ben Yair is like what he say is everything's in our hands.
Yes.
No way that someone else will do the work for you or for miracles. It's up to you. You can fix it and you can bring the Mashiach, each of us.
Exactly right. And that's why I love this ending for Mishnah Sotah. Because as hard as the topic has been, as depressing as this last section has been in particular, but really the overall topic that we've had to deal with of betrayal and betraying trust, to recognize that there is a way to avoid this. There is a way to fix this, both personally, communally, and in terms of the entire global outlook. It just starts with an eagerness to try and make things right, an eagerness to jump in and do more. And the rest will follow. And that, it's as simple as that.
Who was Rabbi Pinchas Ben Yair? Which year? Where?
I'm afraid I do not remember where he is in the Dorot, the generations. So off the top of my head, I'd have to look him up.
But Babylonia or Jerusalem or Israel?
What's that?
Babylon or Palestine?
Oh, definitely Israel, because this is Mishnah, not Talmud. Right? Everybody here, with very few exceptions in the Mishnah, had to live before Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, and that's primarily in the land of Israel. So yeah, I'd have to look him up in my who's who in the Talmud.
That was a very nice and sweet ending.
I told you if you stick it out, it gets better. And that's pretty much the message overall. Well, thank you everyone for studying. Yasher Koach to everyone who's made it all the way through. And we will be continuing with Levirate marriage next week.
And Rabbi, really think about now we are still in COVID, but could be nice if we organize and Seudat Siyum for the synagogue because our group finished another Masechet.
That's a good point. If I can think of a way that we can somehow celebrate that, yes.
Yeah.
Let me think about that.
Because it's a big achievement. Like every Masechet is a big achievement. It's good that people will know that we exist, so maybe they can want to join to us. And how Rabbi Pinchas said, roll over, okay, through
Right.
education and improve the Jewish life.
You're right. You're right. We definitely should celebrate, but everybody should celebrate for themselves as well. It's an accomplishment for each of us individually and for us as a community. All right.
Mr. Koach, Rabbi, thank you so much.
Baruch Yeh, take care, everyone, and Hanukkah Sameach.
Have a blessed day.
And Chodesh Tov. Have a wonderful new month.